All right, last time we were looking at the different views about the rise of the monarchy, and we saw two rather tendentious versions of Saul's rise. One of them may have been from Saul himself, or as we would say these days, from his people who were supporting him. And one of them may actually reflect the historical situation. Both of them, however, have been heavily edited by the Deuteronomistic historian to give a negative cast to the idea of monarchy in general, and Saul's monarchy in particular. We were able to piece together, on the basis of the narrative, a guess, it's only a rough guess, of what may have happened in reality that gave rise to the monarchy. Operating in a traditional lineage setting in which the family groups, the larger family groups, and ultimately the tribes, as they are called in our text, were the basic social and governmental units. But under Philistine pressure, the anti-monarchical northern tribes joined with the south in supporting Saul as king. Samuel, who in the narrative seems to function as the agent of the northern tribes, legitimated Saul with the understanding that Saul would remain under the control of the north. He is from a small tribe in the north and therefore appeared to the outsider to be someone who was rather easily controlled. Saul, however, had other ideas. He recognized that for a monarchy to succeed, it had to have more centralized power than the northern tribes were willing to allow it. Saul therefore set about to build a more powerful monarchy, and it's interesting to see the bits and pieces of the narrative that lead you to these conclusions. First of all, he tried to raise a standing army, which of course is forbidden by Deuteronomy, and therefore the northern tribes would not have signed on easily to that. Nevertheless, he realized that in order to fight the Philistines, he better have a reliable army and not one that was going to go home on him if they got tired of fighting. Second of all, he took for himself priestly powers, and we have a story to that effect, as was the custom elsewhere in the ancient Near East, but was anathema to the northern tribes and specifically forbidden by Deuteronomy. Third, he tried apparently to set up a dynasty by arranging succession for his son Jonathan. However, at every turn, Saul ran into opposition from the northern tribes, which refused to support Saul's efforts. They finally withdrew their support entirely, and for a while apparently worked actively against Saul. Saul and Jonathan, as we know, according to the narrative, were finally killed by the Philistines, and again Israel entered a period of decentralized rule. Finally, David, who has been gathering popular support, even as Saul had been losing it, was anointed king in the south at Hebron. Roughly 7 years later after that, the northern tribes, after having failed to organize any kind of central government in the north, finally allowed David to become king of all Israel. However, in our present text, the story of Saul's decline and his monarchy is told from a much more slanted perspective than the reconstruction that I just gave you, and which is a sort of standard way that scholars tend to read the story. Again, the perspective is that of the Deuteronomistic historian, who does not have anything good to say for Saul. Unlike the story of Saul's rise, however, the story of his decline contains very little pro-Saul material. In fact, the narrative does not really focus on Saul at all, but really on David. So all of those narratives beginning around chapter 13 that we think of as an account of the decline of Saul's power are in fact stories about David's rise when one looks at it from that standpoint. When we introduce David into the narrative, we meet for the first time one of the most remarkable narrative figures in all of Israelite history. What the historical David was like, we really have no idea, but narratively and in the subsequent interpretation of these stories, David plays a simply enormous role. In a real sense, as we are presented with the stories, the success of the monarchy was solely due to the person of David. That is, he's portrayed as a kind of charismatic figure. And although the narrative does not try to hide the fact that he has his faults, and they are numerous, nevertheless, there is something about the person that attracts people to David, or not. David seems to have been a polarizing figure, both in the narrative and also in later interpretations of that narrative. Nevertheless, it will be David and his kingship which serves as the basis for Israel as a political entity all the way down to the present day. And if you go back far enough, the accession of David in Jerusalem in the year 1000 BCE, you know how I know that? That's what Teddy Kollek, the mayor of Jerusalem, said when they decided to celebrate the 3000th anniversary of the city of Jerusalem in the millennium, in the turn of the millennium. So just do the math and you come to the date for David. So this was set totally by the Israeli Tourist Bureau as the historical explanation for why this was going on. But it does, beneath all of that, it does show the extraordinary power of the person of David, not to his skill as a warrior, which was questionable, or as an administrator, which was even more questionable, but to his person. So all of the narratives about him attest to a kind of magnetic quality that attached people to him. Even the Deuteronomists, who seem to be thoroughgoing anti-monarchists, were sucked into his orbit. In a sense, they will remain anti-monarchy, but pro-David. And one of the remarkable things about the book of Kings will be the way in which all successful or even semi-successful Judahite kings will be compared to David, either positively or negatively. And that remains the touchstone for the historian about what a good king ought to look like. David will become the model of the ideal king against whom all others will be judged. Deuteronomic theology, in fact later Christian theology, will be irrevocably shaped by David, or at least the stories about David. David, in a sense, becomes both the monarchy and the people, certainly in the interpretive tradition. Abraham may be the ancestor of Israel, Moses may be the founder of its religion, but David is the nation of Israel, the symbol of its unity and power as a nation. And in subsequent theology, it becomes unthinkable to have a people without also having a nation. And that survives, of course, in Christian thinking into the modern period as well. Jesus is given a Davidic ancestry in the genealogy in Matthew, in the story of Jesus' birth, even though the Gospel of Mark has a story which suggests that they knew fully well that Jesus was not of Davidic descent and has a long explanation for that. So these two things are at odds with each other, but it will be the notion of Davidic descent that finally wins the theological battle. And Jesus will be talked about in that way. And on the Jewish side, David, of course, will become the eschatological king who is to come. So we are dealing here with a very major figure in the narrative and interpretive tradition. So the story of Saul's decline begins immediately, according to the Deuteronomists. Do you remember that chapter 12 is the story of Samuel's farewell speech, what amounts to Samuel's farewell speech at least, to Israel about what a really bad idea it was to reject Samuel himself as a judge ruling over Israel, and how the people were going to regret having chosen a king in the first place, and particularly having chosen Saul. But the people, according to Samuel, are now stuck with Saul, whether they like it or not. And they immediately, of course, have a change of heart, as the people quite often do when they are talked to in this way, and immediately decide they have made a terrible mistake and ask Samuel not to leave them alone with this king, and to not to continue to intercede with the deity on their behalf. Samuel promises to do that, although he doesn't seem to have any idea that this is going to yield a very good result. It's immediately after that that the historian begins the standard formula that will be used to introduce each of the Israelite and Judean kings in the Deuteronomistic history. It is peculiar, however, if you look at verse 1 of chapter 13. Saul was blank years old when he began to reign, and he reigned blank and 2 years over Israel. That blank is in all of our manuscript evidence for this text. We have no variance at all in the manuscript tradition, which means they had no idea how long Saul ruled, or how old he, or how long he reigned, or when he became king, how old he was when he became king. The way in which Hebrew gives numbers, however, anytime you get a structure like this, X and 2, means that it's either 10 and 2, or 20 and 2, or conceivably even 30 and 2. I would doubt anything much beyond that. Now that's interesting, because it means that Saul, according to the tradition, ruled at least 12 years, maybe 22 years. That, for this time in Israel's history, is a relatively long reign. So the historiographic information that they have here suggests a much more successful reign for Saul than the narrative suggests. For the narrative, this introduces the first of 3 stories about Saul's reign that indicate why Saul is finally rejected. In the first one, there is to be a fight against the Philistines, as usual. We are given the details of the battle. Saul, trying, I think, very hard to play by the northern rules governing kingship, realizes that before they go out to battle, they have to offer a sacrifice to the deity. The problem is that he believes, or at least is willing to think, that he himself cannot do this. This has to be done by a designated priest, and Samuel is the local designated priest, and Samuel is no place to be found when somebody needs him. So Saul waits. He's got a battle to fight. The troops are probably getting restive. They want to leave. They want to do something. and they can't do anything until Saul has had the sacrifice offered by Samuel. Finally, Saul has had enough of this. He's afraid of losing his army, and so he forces himself, he will say later, and makes the sacrifice himself. It's almost as if Samuel has been hiding behind the nearest tree. As soon as Saul does this, Samuel appears and condemns the king for taking priestly powers to himself. So that's strike one against Saul. In chapter 14, we have a story about the way in which Jonathan, Saul's son and possible heir to the throne, violates the prohibitions of the Holy War and in extremis eats food during the performance of the Holy War. Saul, on this occasion, agrees to a death penalty against Jonathan for the violation of the Holy War legislation. Again, a violation of Deuteronomy 20, essentially. And the people think this is the craziest thing they've ever heard of. Jonathan is their best warrior. What are you doing, killing off your best warrior in the middle of the battle just because it violates a Deuteronomic prohibition? So even though Saul in this case was willing to do this, the people are not. And so Jonathan is allowed to fight another day. In chapter 15, Saul himself violates the Holy War legislation by taking some of the spoil of the city. We know from Judges and the Achan story what that yields. That's also a violation of the Holy War. And it's all over for Saul at that point. In chapter 15, Samuel again catches up with Saul and accuses him of wrongdoing and violation of the Holy War prohibitions. And Saul is in this encounter after having taken goods to feed the army and having left the king, Agag, of the Amalekites alive, he is confronted by Samuel, who gives you these ringing words: "Has Yahweh great delight in burnt offerings or sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Surely to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. Rebellion is no less a sin than divination." That's a kind of Deuteronomic comparison that only a Deuteronomist would make. And stubbornness is like iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. And Saul's reign is over at this point. So this is all the Deuteronomist has to tell us about the story of Saul's reign. And it is really a kind of minimalist way of looking at it. David enters the story at this point. There are several different accounts, at least two major ones, of the way that David enters Saul's entourage. One of them has to do with what immediately happens when God rejects Saul. God removes the divine spirit that was given to Saul back when Samuel anointed him, and the Spirit of God is now replaced by an evil spirit which torments Saul. And to soothe the tormented Saul, David appears as the famous harp player who plays in order to soothe the fits that Saul is having. The other story, of course, is the story of the killing of Goliath, and that version of things
David appears as a young but fearless warrior in Saul's entourage, and one who kills the giant Philistine Goliath, although later on somebody else will be said to have killed Goliath, so the accuracy of that particular story is not all that clear. From then on, David becomes a somewhat odd figure in Saul's entourage. He seems to be engaged in helping Saul fight against the Philistines in particular. On the other hand, he often makes strange visits to the Philistines for no particular reason, and when Saul gets himself in trouble in battle, David frequently is not around and is off in the Philistine camp somewhere. So one is entitled to wonder exactly which side David is really on when the metal hits the road or the rubber hits the road. David often is not there to be counted on. He also has several occasions in which he is urged to kill Saul. He refuses to do that, even though he could have done so successfully. There are at least two stories that turn on that motif. In each case, David gives the excuse that he himself is not going to raise his hand against the king. On the other hand, it's fairly clear that he's not going to help the king any to escape the Philistines, which is what finally happens to Saul and Jonathan. Without divine protection, the king and his immediate entourage are not able to survive the Philistine onslaught. If one reads the David stories in 1 Samuel carefully, one will see a number of remarks by the Deuteronomistic historian that indicate God's continued support of David and that a kind of divine choice which has already taken place. In the narrative, Samuel has already anointed David as the successor, and that is done at the same time we are told God took the divine spirit away from Saul. So those two things go together. The stories about David's allowing Saul to stay alive on a number of occasions when he could have and possibly should have killed him is told positively in the narrative. David repaid Saul's evil with good. Jonathan loves David more than his father Saul. Saul is disobedient and was afraid of the Philistine Goliath, while David was not, and so on. David's power as a warrior seems to become more and more legendary, leading to the little popular catchphrase, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. So it's clear that there is popular support, at least as the Deuteronomist tells the story. There is popular support for David. In addition to all that, even though David has divine support, he also makes some moves which are not Deuteronomic at all, but are designed to help his case to become king. He doesn't press them, but they are certainly there. The first, and probably the most important, like Saul, David builds up a private army. And the private army originates as a kind of ragtag group of Judahites who are dissatisfied with Saul and with the northern kingship, and who attach themselves to David. And this group becomes his core support against the northern forces, and it will be this group later on which is augmented by two groups of mercenaries, the Keretites and the Pelatites. The Keretites and Pelatites are Mediterraneans from somewhere, and they're clearly mercenary troops of some sort, which form part of David's private guard once he becomes king. And it will be that group which stands by him during the Absalom revolt and basically keeps David in power and protects him against the counter forces that Absalom has gathered from Judah. So we run into this. Now again, this is totally prohibited by Deuteronomy, but the Deuteronomistic historian does not say a word about it when dealing with David. You talk about a tendence in the narrative where Saul is condemned for doing this, David is not. And that creates one of the more ethically focused puzzles of the way the Deuteronomist treats David and his reign. So David can get away with it, Saul can't. And that's a puzzle that the Deuteronomist never comments on. But it's fairly clear what is going on. If we look at 1 Samuel 22, we begin to see how this all works. David left there and escaped to the cave at Adullam. This is after one of the confrontations with Saul, when his brothers and all his father's house heard. So David's support group in the first instance is members of his own tribe down in Judah, which will become the core later on of his government. Talk about appointing family to governmental positions. When we get the account later on of David's appointments, we will see that half of them are from Judah and most of them are members of his family. The other half are from the northern tribes in what looks like an effort to balance off members of his royal court, which is why David's royal court consists of two of everything, one from the north and one from the south. So he is conscious of the way in which one has to try to get these two groups together. So his family went to him, and everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who is discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Those who were with him numbered about 400. And so on. So this is the group that will be his main support during the time when he is having these wars with Saul. Now, how did this work? Well, we get a picture of it in chapter 25. There was a man in Maon whose property was in Carmel. The man was very rich, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. The woman was clever and beautiful, but the man was surly and mean. And he was a Calebite. I mean, what can you expect from Calebites? We're supposed to understand these references, and of course we don't. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So Nabal sent 10 young men, part of this merry band that he's collected, sent 10 of the young men, and David said to the young men, "Now go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name, and so you shall salute him. Peace be with you. Peace be with your house. Peace be to all that you have. Now, I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your sight,
for we have come on a feast day. Please give us whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." This is recognizable from any number of gangster stories in the 30s. This is the shakedown. It is the people showing up in the storefront and saying, "You know, that's a beautiful glass window you have in the front. It would be a shame if it were to be broken. Now we can prevent that for you if you will just give us whatever it is that we want." This kind of political shakedown is not new. It's been going on a long time. And what's remarkable about this Deuteronomistic narrative is that the narrator does not seem to see this as a problem. We'll come back to that kind of issue later on. So David raises a private army to take care of things. He also winds up marrying into two prominent northern families. David himself, of course, is from Judah in the south, and his family is still down there in the south, and he will be king over Judah long before he is king over the north in Israel or Ephraim. And he wants, though, to have some kind of link to Saul's family. So he marries Ahinoam of Jezreel, which is a prominent northern area. It's the agricultural area in the Jezreel Valley. And what do you know? Abigail of Carmel, because Nabal is going to meet an unpleasant end after not being on the right side of David's shakedown. But his wife sees what is going on and is much more clever in figuring out the politics of all of this. So he marries into her family. That will give him a connection with the north. He will also marry one of Saul's daughters. There is no system yet of primogeniture in the northern kingdom. But just in case anyone should ask what David's connections with the north are, here are several of them that he has connected with, and he's put in place. So David seems to be establishing links with with Israel in the north and the northern kingdom. And this will play a role later on when things get rough. So David eventually will become king. He does what Solomon, his son, will eventually do as well, which is a tried and true way of trying to stay in power. Namely, you kill off everyone who might be a potential rival. And it's not just because he is interested, but one of the first things that David does after he is said to be secure in his kingdom, we'll look at this story next time, he is secure in his kingdom. The first question he asks, is there anyone left of the house of Saul so that I may show favor to him? If I were a Saulite left, I would be worried if David is asking that kind of a question. And we'll see that David is not, in fact, as secure in his kingdom as the narrator wants you to think at the very beginning. But from the standpoint of a theological perspective, the kingship of David, after he has finally been successfully established in his kingdom, reaches its height in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel. After all of the remaining Saulites, as far as we know, have been killed off, and there are no opponents any longer, and after the northern kingdom, in spite of all of this, still waits 7 years to finally invite David to be king over them, having some doubts about whether this is a good idea or not.
David has, in the meantime, done two remarkably politically astute things. David has, first of all, moved the old ark from the house of the Levite, where it has been sitting ever since the Philistines captured it when they destroyed Shiloh. And you remember back the narrative of the destruction of the Shiloh shrine and the priesthood of Eli that goes along with it. The ark was captured by the Philistines. They took it back to Philistine territory where they could not handle it. The deity was unhappy living in Philistine territory and let them know about it. And so they finally gave the ark back. When the Israelites take the ark, they have no idea what to do with it because there has not been a new place chosen for the divine name to be. And so they take it to the house of a Levite who is the Levites are the traditional custodians of the ark, and so they know how to handle it apparently, and the ark quits killing people, and an indication that at least temporarily the deity is all right with this kind of arrangement, living in somebody's garage. But this is not going to last very long. So David, after he has captured Jerusalem, and remember the outline of Jerusalem, two different places claim Jerusalem as part of their tribal allotment. If you go back and read, one is Benjamin and the other is Judah. So which one really was given the allotment when the land was divided, we don't know. But what we do know is that in the David story, Jerusalem as the city is still in the hand of the Jebusites. The Jebusites are mentioned among the 7 nations in the land. It seems to be their only stronghold. We don't have references to Jebusites anywhere else except in Jerusalem. So they are usually defined simply as the traditional inhabitants of Jerusalem. David decides that Jerusalem needs to be in their hands. And so one of the things that David does is to engineer the capture of the city of Jerusalem. And there is the famous story about sending the kid up the water tunnel into the city and behind the city wall and opening the gates so that David's troops can come through. How true the story is, I don't know. Until the tourist bureau stopped it, there were all sorts of people who wanted to try to climb the water tunnel inside the city to see if it was doable. This got to be a problem, and so they shut it down. You can't do that anymore if you want to try. But that's the way David apparently breached the city. Thereafter, the city of Jerusalem becomes David's personal property. So it's not just a kind of Washington, D.C. of Israel, which it is. That is, it's land that belongs personally to David. It is neither north nor south. It's located physically more north than it is south. And that's probably deliberate on David's part. So David captures the city as his own personal possession. It will be thereafter known always as the city of David. And so it is his own personal possession. He makes it then, by virtue of setting his kingship up from there, he makes it a political center, and now in chapter 7 he wants to make it a religious center. He has already moved the ark to Jerusalem, cementing the notion that God is in favor of choosing Jerusalem as a religious center. And now in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, David wants to build a permanent structure to house the ark. The ark has been moving in a tent, which is the way we are told the ark moved through the wilderness. It was created, of course, at Sinai in the wilderness, and moved in a tent and a tabernacle, which is a miniature temple, through the wilderness until finally it comes to rest in Jerusalem. It was at Shiloh. We know that it used to be at Shiloh. And then it has been in sort of waiting for David to come along, apparently, and move it safely to Jerusalem. So it's in this tent, and David now proposes to cement this choice of the city as a religious center by building a permanent temple for it. And that's the background that we get now in this famous oracle from Nathan the prophet. David has received rest from all of his enemies round about. This is the trigger phrase, remember, that the Deuteronomistic historian has used on several occasions, indicating that a new chapter of the story is about to begin. So David has gotten rest, and the first thing he wants to do is provide a permanent dwelling place for Yahweh. And so the king was settled in his house. He's already built himself a palace, and decides it's about time to build a permanent structure for Yahweh. Yahweh has given him rest from all of his enemies around about. The king said to the prophet Nathan, who is one of two court prophets that David has. Nathan presumably is a northern prophet, because the other one, Gad the seer, is a southern prophet. So if you take the binaries that he has created in the royal court, Nathan probably comes from the north. See, now I am living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God is still in a tent. And Nathan said to the king, go and do everything that you have in mind, for Yahweh is with you. But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David, thus says Yahweh, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day that I brought the people of Israel from Egypt until this day, but I have been moving around in a tent and a tabernacle. Wherever I have moved among all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people of Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts. So Yahweh basically is saying, I've never lived in a permanent structure, and I don't really think I want to. If I had wanted to, I would have asked for it, and I haven't asked for it yet. Why are you volunteering this, David? So God is rejecting the offer, is what is very clear. But he then goes on, God then goes on and talks about what David is to do and what is going to happen. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be a prince, not a king, a prince, a Nagid, over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you went. I have cut off all of your enemies from before you. I will make for you a great name, like the names of the great ones in the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. And evildoers shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies round about. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that God will make you a house. So God is punning on the idiom for temple, which is a house. God proposes to build a house for Yahweh in Jerusalem. Yahweh says, I don't want a house in Jerusalem, but David, I'm going to make you a house, that is to say, a dynasty. So they're punning on the word house. That's the way the oracle turns. And when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. And he will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me.
And when he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings, but I will not take my steadfast love, fidelity from him. This is all Deuteronomic language. And what is being promised here is really quite remarkable. David is, two things are happening that you should notice. One is that there is an implication that God is in fact choosing Jerusalem as the eternal divine dwelling place in perpetuity, and that the people of Israel will have it as a permanent refuge. So that's a big deal. The other thing that is happening is an even bigger deal for David. David is being promised an endless line of descendants who will be on the throne of Israel. And the throne will eventually move from David to his son, whom we know to be Solomon, although how that happens is an interesting story in its own right. But Solomon will be the designated heir of David. And then it will be Solomon who builds a permanent structure. So God in this article is not apparently opposed to the idea of a permanent structure. It's just a question about who builds it. And for reasons that we won't go into here, but that will be a question asked later on in the material about why doesn't David build the temple, the explanation will be he is an Ish Damim. He is a man associated with bloodshed, and therefore he was not allowed to build it. This overlooks the fact that that title could just as well apply to Solomon, who does exactly the same things that David did in order to secure his throne. So but it's this notion of the eternal choice of Jerusalem as the divine dwelling place, and the notion of eternality about the Davidic line that are the points to remember. This article is going to become the groundwork for what is known as the Jerusalem theology. It is the theology of the priestly houses that ran the temple in Jerusalem, and it is the official theology, not surprisingly, of the Davidic dynasty. And the Deuteronomistic history is going to buy into this, lock, stock, and barrel. And it's an amazing move for the Deuteronomists to make, given their position on kingship. So no kingship in theory, but the Davidic dynasty in perpetuity. And that's going to form the background of the story of the kingdoms, the two kingdoms in the book of Kings. And we will look at that next week, or week after when we get back. But before we can do that, we need to see whether or not the promise to David, in fact, will be honored by Yahweh. Is there, in fact, going to be a descendant of David's who will be on the throne? We'll see that that's going to be a bit of a near thing.